Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Thursday. Of course, Norwich City back at home this weekend. Stoke City, of course, make the visit to Carrow Road. Lots to get into in the sort of next few sort of minutes, I suppose, approaching this game, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and maybe what's ahead for Norwich City. Adam Harvey, joined by my colleague Samuel Seaman for your preview show. Of course, we want your comments, questions, score predictions. We'll work through those as we go through the show. Sam, I think there's been a lot of talk and debate around recent results and maybe emotions, reactions of individuals. There's been certain fans that maybe feel that the Norwich are in a bit of a rut, longer-term project, though, maybe don't view it in quite such a different way. Some people a little bit more reactive to recent results and criticism, and some of that's fair and justified. The performances haven't been great, but 8 points from the last 5 games. It depends how you want to look at that as a context. Obviously, back-to-back wins, or you can look at the kind of the 3 results more recently, 2 from 9 in terms of points haul. So, do you have any concerns? Because I think you maybe look at that Derby and Preston game. I had more concerns over those two than maybe the whole game. The first 20 minutes of that game very, very poor, but I felt over the sort of 70 minutes in the latter stages they actually grew into that game and probably on another day come away with 3 points.
Yeah, I agree. I think the whole game was quite a lot better than Preston, and probably Derby was a little bit better than Preston as well. I think the fact that Preston game was in the middle probably makes it feel quite a lot worse, because the Derby performance wasn't really a good performance, but ultimately they would have won if it wasn't for one silly mistake and the concession of a pretty poor penalty to concede in added time. And then the whole performance, like you mentioned, I thought they probably just about deserved to win. I don't think they were clearly the better team, but as you say, after sort of the 25-30 minute mark, Norwich dominated that game. They moved the ball a lot better, and they were the sort of team that Johannes Hoftorp wants, really. Probably, actually, when you consider the fact that Watford had 10 men for most of the game, it was probably a better performance overall than that one. But I can understand the feeling around it, because the context, I think, is the most important thing. And you remember how we were all feeling after those back-to-back wins and what we were talking about in terms of the positives going in Norwich's favour, this run of games and how great it was looking, and the fact that Norwich were going to go and qualify for the playoffs. And I think we were probably all guilty of getting drawn into that a little bit. But that does make it feel like quite a missed opportunity when you take into consideration the positions that those 3 teams are in. And I think that's why there was a bit of frustration, a bit of anger, because just as those fans had allowed themselves to start dreaming about short-term achievement as well as the long-term goals, they were dashed almost immediately by quite a poor run of form. But I think overall, and probably the number of days since that whole game and the fact they've had a whole week between games helps with this. But overall, you look back on it and say, ultimately, as we've said a few times already, this is the sort of team that we predicted at the start of the season. We were all saying transitional season, average championship team. And unfortunately, what they've done in the last three games is probably prove us right. Of course, there's always an opportunity to turn things round and to make a statement. And that's what this game is about, really, this weekend. But yeah, not the end of the world. And ultimately, I know this is broadening out the discussion a lot, but I think if they did get into the playoffs, they maybe wouldn't be that likely to go and win them anyway. So yeah, it doesn't make much difference really, as far as I'm concerned. But I can certainly understand some of the frustration, because it does come down to that missed opportunity feeling, doesn't it?
It does indeed. In terms of sort of both short and longer term thinking, in terms of the January editions, we've now started to see a little bit more of them in recent games. Matej Jurasek, obviously, we've seen an 18-minute cameo off the bench against Preston. We saw him get the start against Hull, played sort of 65 minutes. Some really bright sparks, some maybe more difficult moments, but I think on the whole enough to maybe be excited for what the future can hold for him. Of course, Jacob Wright, a couple of starts, one of those obviously thrusted in against Preston, kind of due to the Kenny McLean situation, got retained displaced in that whole game. And I felt certainly after maybe struggling a little bit, grew into the game a little bit. Obviously not seen much of McConville yet. And just Dobbin, obviously we've had a more wider debate about in recent times. But in terms of Wright and Jurasek, what have you made of the early signs? Obviously still very early on, so it's hard to make a firm judgment at this stage, but excited by what you've seen in sort of the infancy of those two in Norwich City careers?
I'm not sure I've been quite as excited about Jacob Wright as some have. I think that actually that last, especially the second half against Hull, was a really significant improvement. But ultimately, you look at the body of work overall, and he hasn't, for me, quite lived up to the hype just yet, especially when you consider the fact that many were hoping he would be the solution to a problem that it feels like there's been at Carrow Road for a number of years now. But I do think he made some steps in the right direction. And if he can replicate that sort of second half performance on a regular basis, then he will be living up to the hype for me. But ultimately, it comes down to consistency. And of course, when he's 19 years old, he's just arrived at Norwich on loan, not really played many senior games in his career. It's quite hard to judge him for that. But I'd say, looking at the broader picture, he's somebody who we can see the talents of, but you probably do need to look at him, and you can see probably why Norwich have been able to sign him and why Manchester City haven't kept him around, and he hasn't made the sorts of strides that some of their young players have with the first team. But I do like him as a player. I like what he's trying to do, and I think he fits Johannes Torp's system pretty well. But yeah, it is just about sort of finding that consistency and maybe having some of those more experienced players around him, like Kenny McLean, Marcelino Nunez, Emi Marcondes, when they all come back from injury in the next couple of weeks, will really help him. But in that really young midfield where he's almost playing the most important role, and he's shoved into that team when I think he's made something like 4 or 5 senior appearances in his life up to that point, I think was always going to be a tough challenge. But yeah, I can see some of the positives. In terms of Jurasek, I think that for me is a much clearer one to get excited about, and a much easier one to see why Norwich have committed the sorts of money that they have. And again, it feels like we're having that debate around a Norwich winger, which seems to be a theme of this season, in terms of you need some end product and you need to see goals and assists. There are probably a couple of crosses that he's put in that have deserved some of those. There was one in the Preston game where, if you felt like if Josh Sargent was on the pitch when he flushed that ball across the 6-yard box, then he's there tapping that in. So I think he's been a little bit unlucky in that sense. But what I really like about him, and I think there's a little bit of this about Lewis Dobbin as well, is the fact that he gets the ball and you can tell immediately that he wants to make something happen. There are so many wingers in today's game, and I can understand it. And, I like possession-based football, so I'm not necessarily knocking it as a function of the whole team. But for individual players, you feel like sometimes the art of the winger has been lost at the top level, because you see a lot of players who are more like sort of number 10s out there, and they're more likely to just take the ball forward and then lay it off to somebody else or pass the ball backwards. But those two, particularly Jurasek, look like players who are going to get the ball and immediately think, okay, how can I help the team score a goal from here? How can I beat this man that's on my back and get the ball in the box or have a shot? And I think that's the sort of player that Torp sort of told us Norwich would be getting when we asked about him before he signed or just after he signed, and when Norwich were waiting for him to be available. So I think Torp's probably got that diagnosis right. And as I mentioned, it's now about, converting that promise into goals and assists. But after one game and a bit, it's probably quite harsh to judge him on that. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he can produce for the rest of the season and in the years to come in a Norwich shirt. But I'll throw that one back to you, Adam. What have you made of Norwich's January signings so far?
Yeah, I think probably agree with a lot of your assessment there. Right, it's clearly a tidy footballer there. He's obviously come through the Manchester City school, and I think you can see with Callum Doyle, very, culturally, very, very clever with the way he plays and comfortable on the ball. I think wedded to a system at Man City, which is obviously to an extent replicable with Norwich in terms of, the play and the way they want to play. Obviously different levels completely, but, in terms of a technical skill set, it feels like he's there. Still believe the physicality maybe is catching him out a little bit at the moment. He's still a young man and maybe not played a lot of men's senior football in his career. I think, only a few sort of, I think, is it 4 appearances for Man City, all of those off the bench, maybe a few sort of moments within US tours and stuff for City, but never really in a sort of thrusted championship environment where it's, full on, blooded tackles can be difficult in the cauldron of noise, fans in a stadium. So I think there's a lot of adapting there for him to get used to. But obviously, and he's still new in the building, moved away from Manchester for the first time and his family. So I can imagine that's all a bit of a unsettling times for him at the moment. So I think in time, maybe with a little bit more game time at the club, a little bit more adaptation time, I think there's a player there that can work. Obviously, whether Norwich decide to take the option up at the end of the season, it is still within their hands. I think that's probably a good thing with this signing. They've not committed £4 million, and then maybe he's actually a couple of years away from being a regular first team starter. Norwich can make kind of that judgment in the here and now and what they need for the short term, the longer term, the mid term. I think that's probably good. In terms of Jurasek, yeah, I'd agree with you. I think he just offers them a little bit something different. I think obviously we want to see that end product eventually, but he's not played a lot of football so far, so I'm not gonna bat him down on that. But clearly, crossing wise, seems like he's got that in his skill set, able to get in behind, quite direct. And I think, moving forwards with what Norwich want to try and do, and the fact they do create a lot of opportunities for players, and their wingers are often involved in games, it feels like he's probably come to the right club in his stage of his career as well, because he still has got a fairly big body of work in terms of what he's done over in the Czech Republic at Slavia. I know it's a little bit out of favour in the latter stages, but certainly a good player. In terms of other Manchester City loanees that are on Norwich's books at the moment, obviously Callum Doyle collected his 10th yellow card against Hull. That's going to be a 2-match suspension. The cut-off point for players in the Championship is after 37 games, so obviously after 33 games. That is a 10-game suspension for him. That probably opens up the door for Jose Cordoba, who we've not seen a lot of. Obviously did get the start against Sunderland. We obviously got the red card in that game and suspended, and not seen much of him since. So in terms of him having an opportunity these next 2 games, Sam, because he's obviously not played a lot in recent weeks, and you actually asked Johannes last week at the press conference about him, and has it been frustrating for him having to bide his time and be on the bench? Clearly he's still adapting to life in England, but a senior pro, played a lot of games in his career up to this point at 23. So yeah, I suppose big opportunity for him now in these next couple of games.
Indeed, and I think it's the sort of situation where you look at some injuries and suspensions and you think, in a way, that sort of plays into the manager's hands and obviously into Johannes' hands in this situation. Obviously, Callum Doyle is very good, and I think we've all seen that this season. And for the most part, everyone's been really impressed with all of his performances. But the fact that you've got a £3 million summer signing, who everyone was very excited about, who Torup clearly rates highly, who we've spoken to Ben Napper about, and it's rare that I've seen any sporting director get as excited about any player as he was about Jose Cordoba. So he's clearly somebody who they've brought in and really, really rate, and he's been in a bit of a difficult situation. Yes, Torup praised his professionalism, as you mentioned, when I asked about what it's been like for him on the bench in the last few weeks. There was also that incident where he slept in before the Watford game and wasn't included in the matchday squad as a result. So it probably has been a tough time for him as somebody who came in at Norwich, was, of course, deciding between moving to Carrow Road and to Rangers. So he was somebody who was really, really wanted. At his previous club, he was a starter week in, week out, and probably one of their best players as well. Even with his national team in Panama, he's one of the sort of top 2 or 3 key players. So he's somebody who for the last few years has been really, really used to almost being one of the first names on the team sheet. And that was close to the status that he had when he was fit at the start of the season. So I think he'll be absolutely raring to go. And the way that I think it works for Torup is that he doesn't have to make that decision. He doesn't have to decide whether to drop Callum Doyle or Jose Cordoba. Of course, Callum Doyle can have no complaints when he's not in the team on Saturday, but it gives Cordoba an opportunity to impress. And the fact that it's 2 games as well, although obviously losing any key player for 2 games is a negative, it gives Cordoba a bit of time to actually feel settled rather than just coming in, playing a game, out he goes again for Doyle to come back in. So in a way, it almost feels like it works pretty well for all parties. Callum Doyle has started every single Championship game this season as well, and also started in the FA Cup in last month as well. So yeah, I actually think it's not the end of the world. And if you were to pick a time in the season for it to happen, it would be now. There have been times when they've had injury problems at left back and you'd need him to fill in there, or at centre back, and Cordoba wouldn't have been fit to step in. You had all sorts of different situations with injuries and suspensions where it would have been difficult for for Norwich to lose somebody like that. But at this time in the season, it's probably perfect timing. Give Doyle a bit of a rest for 2 games, see what Cordoba can do, given the fact that he probably will be the starting left centre-back next season as well. And just boost morale for everyone, really. So actually, I think, although it sounds really strange saying that Callum Doyle being suspended is a good thing for Norwich, I think when you look at the bigger picture, it's not really too bad, to be honest.
Yeah, you mentioned the defenders and having options. One player I just wanted to ask you a little bit about, and maybe what you viewed his recent performances like, is Lucien Mahovo, who I know we were having heavy praise for in kind of, the Swansea game when he got dropped in, and he's very good against Watford as well, I felt, but maybe these sort of last couple of games, I just felt he looked a little bit tired, a little bit leggy. I know that the whole game he really struggled in sort of the first 25 minutes. A lot of Hull's sort of positive attacking outlets were coming down his side, and he was getting beaten quite often. I know there's been a few fans on socials maybe seeing maybe Krasene's got his opportunity again now. Does he get thrown back in? So where do you sit on that debate? Because obviously there has now been a week between, that whole game and now. So obviously last week was a 3-game week and he started every single game. So Krasene, Mahovo, who do you go with on Saturday?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and you just find yourself going back to those quotes that Torok produced about. I think it was Sienats, wasn't it, where he said it's 2 games starting and then 1 on the bench is the ideal for a player you're trying to develop, and of course that hasn't been close to the situation for Mahovo. As soon as he was thrown into the starting lineup, he started every single game. So if Torok wants to go by that formula, then the time to give him a rest is probably long overdue. But as you mentioned, it is the first time. I think it's the first time since he came into the starting lineup, or maybe it's not. But obviously, he's had to play a lot of games in that period, and now he has a full week to rest. It wouldn't really make sense to me to rest him now if you didn't rest him last week when there were all of those games and he had to play so many minutes in such quick succession. But there were alarm bells, obviously, in the whole game. You mentioned some of the defensive issues, and I thought for most of the game, and actually in the second half especially, and after basically Norwich seemed to wake up in that game, he was quite good. Even in the bits where he struggled, I thought he was okay in the whole half and on the ball, but he did get exposed a couple of times down that flank. I think, to be honest, as key as Borja has been this season, and as big as it is for Norwich to have him back, he maybe doesn't help with that. I don't think he gives as much defensive output or protection as Lewis Dobbin did in front of Mahovo in those first couple of games. So that probably was a factor. And I thought Sainz was probably part of things in the whole game as well. But yeah, he didn't look particularly assured in a defensive sense. And of course, that will be something that Torok will be considering. But there have also been games when Krasene hasn't really been, the best in a defensive sense. And I think maybe he's been quite harshly judged. I think he's been pretty good. And certainly for a £1.5 million young player who fits into the homegrown quota and plays in a position where Norwich were really short in the summer, I think he's actually been a very good signing. But there have been concerns with him as well. So it depends on who Torok really trusts at the moment. I think for now it's maybe too early to be dropping Mahovo. I don't think he's actually been that bad that I'd be considering dropping him out of the starting 11. But maybe if you had another option, if you had almost a Callum Doyle, even if Callum Doyle was hadn't had that suspension, and you could have Cordoba to slot into centre back and Doyle to go out there, maybe it would be time to have a sort of slightly more, and it sounds strange saying experienced given his age, but a more experienced, more ready to go option in that position, just for a couple of games to give both of those players, Mahovo and Krasene, a bit of time to sort of develop on the training pitch and focus on those things. But of course, that's not the situation. So for me right now, especially after a full week of just training and not a game, I would probably stick with Mahovo, but I can understand why the debate has sort of opened up. What would you make of it, Adam? Who would you choose if you were Torok?
I would probably just edge towards Mahovo. I think the fact he's got the week off now is just a bit of recuperation. It's obviously been tough for him. He's been, not played a lot of games in a senior career. We spoke quite heavily when he first came on the scene, and the fact that this time last year he was playing for Boston United in the National League North, and to make that jump up to the Championship. Fisher's kind of had a little bit more of a suppose, extended period before his jump from the National League to the Championship. I mean, last season he sort of had opportunities off the bench here and there, and the odd couple of starts, but not kind of a proper being thrown in at the deep end, sort of 5-6 games in a row, and obviously still adapting to you kind of look at some of the opponents I suppose he's been up against. I mean, there was Sissoko in the Watford game who's had a very successful career, so he's not had it easy, but I think he's always looked pretty assured. Obviously had some difficult moments, but that's going to be natural for young players, and I think as Torrance kind of alluded to throughout this season, it's kind of those moments where you almost learn from those mistakes, and then when you're put in those same positions again in future times, maybe next season, maybe the latter stage of this season, you almost know how to adapt and how to deal with those. So I think it's probably good for him to keep in the squad, retain his confidence. You don't want to be pulling him out and almost kind of throwing him under the bus a little bit. Just maintain those levels. And I think in a home setting against a Stoke side that don't score many goals, I think they're the lowest scorers in the Championship. It feels like he's got an opportunity. And ultimately, Norwich have only conceded 3 goals this week in the games he's been in. So it's it's not been the complete end of the world. In terms of Stoke, I saw someone asking about how we feel about Stoke and I suppose the task ahead. Not been a great season for the Potters. I think 3 managers been in the dugout. They started the season with Stephen Schumacher. Ryan Shawcross took temporary charge before they appointed, of course, a man we know very well in Narcissus Pelash. That really did not go to plan. 3 wins in 19 games. I think they had a couple of big thumping wins and some pretty poor results. And that meant that Jonathan Walters, their sporting director, got a bit of heat. He decided to make a change. He got sacked kind of the end of mid-December time, decided to pivot in a completely different direction. Of course, Mark Robins, former Norwich City striker, but a legend at Coventry in terms of the remarkable job he done there, taking them from sort of the depths of League Two up to the top of the Championship. And they almost obviously one kick of a ball away from the Premier League in the playoff final, got the FA Cup semi-final last year. A very experienced manager at this level, and it feels like they're probably going to have enough to stay up this season. Sam, would you agree with that? I mean, it's not going to be an easy test tomorrow, but they are struggling for goals a little bit. As I mentioned, they are the lowest scorers in the league.
I agree that they probably will have too much to get relegated. As you mentioned, they've got a very good head coach with a good Championship record. And although they have got those problems in front of goal, I think in the Championship, if you're reliable from a defensive standpoint, which I think they can be, then that's usually good enough to keep you in the division. Being honest, the level of the teams down at that end of the division isn't particularly high. I think the squad depth that Stoke have and the quality in their team is quite a lot higher than some of those teams around them. So in terms of their season, I think they're in an okay position, especially with Mark Robins, who isn't going to make any stupid decisions and knows how to extract points in this league. But well, we can see from across the season the struggles that all 3 head coaches have had, that it is a team that's struggling. Maybe they haven't quite gelled in the way that they might have done. They've tried to chuck money at transfers for years now, and they've brought in a lot of players, and it doesn't really feel like they've had an opportunity to ever really settle, especially when you consider those managers. And it's not just this season, going back a few seasons before that, there's been quite a significant churn and quite a focus on the short term, which of course you can understand when their Championship status is at threat. But it doesn't feel like a team that's had much of an opportunity to develop together. Maybe that's what they'll do with Mark Robins, who you'd say should have the quality and the short-term success to at least keep people on board until he can take them back up to at least sort of mid-table or challenging for the playoffs. But obviously, the main reason why we're focused on Stoke is what sort of performance they're going to produce at Carrow Road. And I think Norwich do go into this one as favourites. Of course, when you consider the last few results, that maybe doesn't mean too much, but you'd say that the quality in the Norwich team is a little bit better. They certainly look like more of a cohesive unit that's been working together on the same idea for longer than Stoke do. But Norwich weren't really that much of the better side in the reverse fixture, even in that Pelash tenure, which obviously didn't end particularly well when he was quite a new manager there. Sorry, Mark, my phone's just going off. That will teach me to turn it on silent when we do a live video in the future. But on Stoke, it's just one of those where if Norwich can produce their best performance, which To be honest, with a full week to prepare, they should be able to do, and with the motivation that I'm sure this last week will have provided them, they should be able to do that. But again, you can never really take anything for granted in the Championship, and certainly not with this Norwich team, which is obviously pretty inconsistent and still looks like it's in transition. So yeah, although I think Stoke will have too much to get relegated, I think, to be honest, it's the sort of game that Norwich will feel they should be winning at home.
Indeed, yeah. Thankfully, the transfer window shut, or people will be speculating that somebody's calling you to try and get you to make a transfer move, Sam.
If they want to, then they can. I'm a free agent.
There we go. We'll dip into a few of these comments and questions, but before we move on further on into the show, Hanno asking the question: which player do you, Norwich, regret letting go of most for free in the last summer transfer window? I mean, I'm kind of thinking of who they let go, but I think probably with those individuals, probably not any of them, to be honest. The wages, obviously, of a lot of those individuals were quite high. Obviously, Ben Gibson will be returning to Carrow Road this weekend. With Stoke, I know he's not had the greatest of seasons there by all accounts. I spoke to the Stoke journalist yesterday on Terrace Talk, which is available now. You can watch that after this. And he sort of said he struggled a little bit. I know Danny Bart's having a little bit of resurgence at Blackburn, but you look at kind of the age profiles of those two individuals, the likes of, a lot of the others that went on, probably don't really fit the longer term strategy of what Norwich are trying to do.
No, I'd agree with that. And to be honest, they're not really in positions where you'd say Norwich have struggled either. Obviously, Nulis left, and he was maybe the highest quality option that they had. Sam McCallum as well. And I suppose McCallum, from a squad building point of view, would have fitted with what they wanted to do. He's English, he's relatively young, and Nulis, in terms of quality and the technical ability, might have fit with the system. But you look at their left back department now, and they've got Lucian Mahovo, who's a good young talent. They've got Ben Krasene, who, again, I think will turn out to be a very solid buy for Norwich. They've got Callum Doyle, who has produced pretty well as well. Centre back, as you mentioned, Bart and Gibson left the building, and again, they're looking pretty solid in that department. The only area you'd really be looking at for Norwich to maybe improve upon is midfield, and that's not even really been an issue with the quality of the personnel. It's just the fact that they've got barely any of them available at the moment. But from memory, and this is tough trying to recall who every one of them was, but there weren't any midfielders in there, or there certainly weren't any key midfielders in there. Of course, Gabriel Sara left to join Galatasaray, but not on a free transfer. It wasn't the end of his contract. So yeah, I'm not sure really there are any of them that I would like to have back at Norwich, to be honest. But it's a good question, and I probably do need to look at that list again if I'm gonna answer that question a little bit better.
Indeed, yeah. Particularly when you kind of account for the fact they managed to bring in Emi Marcondes on a free transfer. He certainly feels, in terms of an age profile, a little bit older, but for the longer term project fits a little bit more what they're trying to do. Stephen on Facebook asking, have we heard anything more about the injuries? Well, we've got the press conference tomorrow lunchtime with Johannes Torp, so we'll get a little bit more of an update on Marcelino Nunez, Kenny McLean's obviously situation. I did see some pictures on, I think it's on El's TikTok, with Marcelino's ankle. Still looks quite swollen, but in the gym seemingly, so that's probably a little bit more positive, I suppose, from where we were this time last week. Hannah asking another question: will Hoff give Tony Springett a chance later in the season? He's been not on the bench at all season, not been given a chance. Well, he's been injured for quite a sustained period. I think the last update you had, I just actually got it up on my phone a little while ago, was on the 31st of January that he's had surgery on his back and will be out for a while, maybe till even the summer. It's not been the season for him that we hoped for. We'll support him and give him a fair chance when he's back. But obviously the issue is he is out of contract, I think, in the upcoming summer, if I'm correct. So probably feels like his race at Norwich is probably run, Sam.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because Torp has sort of gone out of his way to speak about him in press conferences when maybe he hasn't even been asked about him. So he's obviously someone that Torp's been thinking about. But I mean, you look at the fact that he struggled to get into the team at Northampton and at Derby, probably wasn't really loved too much by the Norwich fans when he was playing a few games under David Wagner and Dean Smith. And obviously, he always gave everything for the team. I don't think you could fault his work rate, and he's a decent enough footballer. But I don't really see, if the likes of Jaden Warner and Jonathan Tompkinson aren't good enough to fit into this team, then I'm not really sure that Tony Springett does, unfortunately. And obviously, any chance that he would have had to prove me wrong and to try and get into the Norwich team has been scuppered by those injuries. So yeah, I think Torrett was right summing it up by saying that it's been a tough season, and I agree. I'm not sure I see him ever breaking back into that Norwich team, to be honest.
Yeah, particularly when you got a lot of sort of young academy lads doing well. I think, is it Brandon Forbes, the lad they got from Dundee, who seems to be doing quite well. He plays that position. So there's probably those kind of in a younger age category now to spring it that are probably starting to push their claims a little bit further down. Another question from Hanno. We need to give Signs a contract renewal. Letting him go in the summer for extra pocket money is plain stupid when he's already in the building here. Building a great legacy, unless he wants to leave, which is a different story. But I don't see that with him. But where do you see that? So obviously we are another 3-4 months away from that being a real issue. But 1 year left on his contract. By the time we reach the summer, it feels probably unlikely from sort of a Norwich standpoint that he's going to sign a new deal, or they're going to offer him one, because you think probably given off the back of this season, there's going to be interest from domestically and probably from abroad.
Yeah, and obviously we're all speculating about Sainz and his mentality in terms of his own future, and without knowing him personally, it's quite hard to do that. But I've got to say I don't really feel that it does make sense for Sainz to stay, and you're right probably that you look at some of the clubs that have been linked. Bilbao, which is close to where he's from, back in Spain, Napoli earlier this week, and we know that they actually made an inquiry in January, some links in Turkey as well, and numerous quite big clubs who, to be honest, are all quite a lot bigger than Norwich. And unless Sainz grew up a Norwich fan, which feels fairly unlikely to me, then I don't really see what incentive he has to stay at the club. To be honest, although obviously it's an exciting project and there are reasons to want to play for Norwich, I'm not sure Yohannesov Torp has quite got it to a stage where they can compete with the likes of Napoli and Bilbao and Galatasaray and other clubs like that if Sainz does get to a position in the summer of 2026 where he is out of contract. So to be honest, I would be selling him, and I think it's going to be tough for him to produce the sort of form that he did at the start of the season as well. So maybe it wouldn't really be the end of the world. Of course, you'd like to get a bigger fee than they probably will if they do sell him in the summer. But when you've got a player in that position, I don't really see much of an alternative for Ben Napper, because even if you hold on to him until January next year, he can then sign a pre-contract with foreign clubs. And it sounds like there's plenty of them who would be keen to sign him at that point. So, unfortunately, it probably is time to savour these last few months for Sainz at Carrow Road, because I would be shocked if he is still here for the 25-26 season, to be honest.
Yeah, and you kind of look at the model that Norwich operate under. A player they brought in for free, they could probably sell for upwards of, certainly 10 to 15 million at least, absolute bare minimum, even if he didn't do a lot else between now and the end of the season, with obviously 12 months left on his contract. And you kind of take Torp at his word, Napper at his word. They want to reinvest that money into 2 or 3 sort of individual players. They've obviously got the maybe less constraints from previous years where the money would have to, not go back into the playing squad. They'd have to try and fill other holes. It feels like now if they were to recoup any sort of figure, they could probably go and pump it straight back into the squad and strengthen 2-3 areas with that sort of income. So yeah, it feels certainly very unlikely that it'd be a Norwich player by this time next season. But stranger things have happened, so we're not going to get ahead of ourselves. A question here around Angus Gunn. What club do you think would take Angus if we do let him go? Maybe difficult to pinpoint a club, but there's certainly been interest from Scotland, further abroad, domestically. I suppose, where do you pitch his level? As an individual, do you think there'll be top flight clubs from across the pond that would be willing to try and take him on a permanent deal?
I think probably the logical step would be Celtic or Rangers. Obviously, he's got quite a significant reputation up there, having now become first choice for the national team. And in terms of level, it's probably quite a high level and quite big clubs that he could go to without really worrying about being the first choice. I don't think there's any chance that he would go to one of those and have to sit behind a goalkeeper and not get the game time. But you look at him and the amount of time he spent at Manchester City, not really getting in to things, struggling at Southampton, and it took until he got to a decent age really for him to really become a first choice. So I think he'll want to do that wherever he goes. And if he did go to the Premier League again, I'm not sure he could really be guaranteed that. I think he would have to at least fight for his place somewhere, and he might go in as the first choice. But as he saw at Southampton, he'd probably be on the edge of sort of losing that place. So I think if he wants guaranteed first team football week in, week out, like he has at Norwich at the moment, it's either for me Scotland or maybe a league like sort of Serie A or La Liga, where the level is just slightly lower than the Premier League, and maybe he could go to one of the clubs sort of mid-table or lower half in those divisions. But I think he's certainly good enough to play that sort of role. It's just about obviously where the interest comes from, and when you look at his reputation and where it is in certain places, you'd say that Scotland feels fairly likely to tick most of the boxes. So if I had to guess now, I'd say one of those two, but obviously it's very hard to know, and there will be a lot of things change for a lot of different clubs who we don't know much about between now and the end of the season. So hard to predict, but I think that's the sort of level that maybe he'll be pitching at, and the level that he can play at the moment without worrying that he's going to end up being a second choice again, which we know was a frustrating position for him to be in when he first arrived at Norwich, and probably a difficult position that he had to stay in for a little bit longer than was ideal for his career. But at 29 now, he'll want to be playing games, and either way, it will be interesting if he does leave Norwich to see which sort of club he does go to.
Indeed, yeah. A comment here off the back of our last debate from the Chingford Canary. If we do buy another 2 or 3 players with the signs money, are we getting near to a point where we're just a squad of average players with lots of them on the sidelines and not improving? Which is kind of interesting, because I know obviously you went down to the fan hub earlier in the week and spoke to Johannes Torup about kind of, I suppose, these individuals. You maybe look at the likes of Sienat's bought for big money and maybe not quite living up to what certain fans would feel he could do at the moment. But there is kind of that longer term element with individuals like him where, he probably is Sargent's natural successor. He's still going to be learning off Josh Sargent, still, 4 years younger than Sargent. So that kind of tells you the scale of maybe him as an individual and where he's at still at his career. So it certainly feels like Norwich are maybe trying to adopt that kind of almost Brighton model a little bit, where you kind of buying in players for lesser fees relative to obviously Brighton in the Premier League, but players that maybe are 2 or 3 years away from being a proper first team option. So I suppose that's maybe how they reinvest this money, Sam, is kind of looking sort of more into that longer term. But hopefully at some point these players can almost become a cycle where they can just keep selling them for higher fees, reinvest more money further down the pecking order.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, really. And like you said, I sort of asked Torup about that on Monday, because I think it's a good point. If you sell 2 or 3 players every summer and they're all your best players, then how do you ever get to a point where you have 11 at least, and then subs who are good enough to go on and be part of a team that can challenge for promotion? But I think the number of players who they have, that's what it comes down to. Obviously, in the sort of prime bracket right now, they haven't got too many, but all of them, or most of them at least, are getting towards that upper tier level and towards the sorts of performances that will attract, big Premier League clubs or significant fees. You look at Josh Sargent, obviously, Marcelino Nunez, I'd start to put in that bracket as well at the moment. And the idea will be to have those 11 players or those 18 players, whatever it is, getting to that sort of performance all at the same time. So that's when you need to be having a summer like they did last summer, where they brought in 8 or 9 sort of under 23s who will then hopefully in the next couple of years all progress and all reach their peak at the same sort of time. And yes, there will be 2 or 3, cherry picked every year by those bigger clubs, but hopefully it gets to a point where if they do the same sort of thing this summer, probably to a lesser extent, but if they do that, then maybe the year after that they'll have 8 or 9 players who are all getting to 23, 24 and have all got a couple of years of championship experience behind them all at the same time. And you're certainly not going to end up selling 11 or 12 key players all in the same summer. So that's probably why it takes time, because you need quite a lot of players to progress to that level at the same time and to hit that peak almost in unison. But that's what this project is designed to do, and that's what Johannes Torup and Ben Napper are employed to create. So they'll certainly back themselves to do that. But this is one of the biggest problems with squad building, and it probably does underline why this is a project that people are talking about taking 2 or 3 years rather than just the one, because you have one season and everything gets a bit better, and then you have to sell the likes of Sargent and Sainz. But ideally, your Schwartaus, Krizenes, even sort of the slightly older ones like Slimane, Sienats, Forsen. That's just 5 players that I've named off the top of my head who they'll hope can go and be the next Sainz and Sargents in the future. And that's what the aim of the model is. But again, like everything at the moment, it's going to take patience and it's going to take time.
Yeah, interesting. The 3 players you mentioned, it all feels like certainly Nunez, maybe the first couple of years he struggled. It's only really been the last couple of years that he's really developed and reached a level where you think, yep, top flight clubs or top domestic clubs might be interested in him. Same with Sargent, you kind of take that first year. I know it was in the Premier League and it was difficult for him, but even relative to the Championship, when he stepped down the first season, was nowhere near the level he's at now, where I think I saw a stat the other day, he's got 14 goal contributions in 19 games this season. So, that just shows you the output of that individual. And Sainz, I know, again, last season wasn't easy for him, came with an injury, but it feels like his levels certainly have gone up massively this season, comparison to last season. So, intriguing in terms of that, in terms of the individuals they've got in the building now, the likes of Force, and maybe it'll take them a couple of years to get to that level, but hopefully at some point they'll reach that. So, yeah, interesting question and a good one there from Chingford Canary. Interesting question this. Name 3 former Norwich players that you'd like to sign back, Sam. We've got one from here saying Maddison, Jacob Murphy, Buendia. We're a little bit on the spot that. And I suppose you kind of, how we sort of bracketing this, are these individuals that fit what Johannes Torup is doing at the moment? Because, you probably need to be signing younger players, or do you try and spin it a little bit and maybe look at players that were in their prime really good for Norwich? Because, you could probably go out and say someone like Johnny Howsam, but relative to his age now and his probably legs maybe not being quite where they were, it probably feels a little bit more difficult. So I don't know how you want to approach it, Sam, but how are you going to answer Hanno's question there?
Yeah, it's a really tough question, because if we are just taking players when they were at their best at Norwich and transplanting them into the current squad, then that's quite easy to do, because we can just go through the history and, probably say Darren Huckabee and Wes Houlihan, Martin Peters and whoever else. But right now, especially given, like you say, they're trying to sort of go for a younger model, there aren't that many out there. Like I suppose like an Alex Matos would be the next sort of one, and I think he's been pretty inconsistent on loan at Oxford and Huddersfield. So the level of players who Norwich would probably actually look at now maybe isn't that high. I think those 3 shouts, Maddison, Jacob Murphy and Buendia, are quite good, because they're all players sort of in and around their prime. Of course, all players who will be hoping to, or are either currently playing in Europe or will be hoping to do so next season. So, that feels like it's fairly unlikely. But if I had to just transplant players from their prime, I think I've spoken quite a lot about how I feel like Norwich really need a sort of number 10. So probably Buendia would actually be the first one on that list. Maybe chuck Wes Houlihan in there as well for a little bit of backup. And then I'd probably also look for a defensive midfielder. So maybe Ollie Skip, actually. That feels like a sort of... oh, there we go. A good old Chingford Canary. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think actually that feels like somewhere around realistic, because he's a decent age, he's homegrown, and as Chingford mentions, not really lighting the world on fire at Leicester. So maybe that's a slightly more realistic one, because I certainly don't think Emi Buendia or Wes Houlihan are going to be signed by Ben Napper anytime soon. But hopefully I've filled enough time for you to come up with some answers, Adam, because I'm going to throw that one back at you as well.
Yeah, I think given their midfield issues at the moment, Ollie Skip was one. In terms of the age profile, still probably fits what they're trying to do. So that would make sense. Maybe Harry Kane, bring him back for Antti Sienats to learn off. Doesn't fit the age profile at the moment, but maybe could do kind of that squad building role. And I'd imagine he'll score a few goals at this level. So not sure he quite fits in terms of the wage structure or the age profile. But Yeah, maybe him. Madison or Buendia for the attacking midfield kind of role. I still feel Norwich maybe are a little bit short of that creative number 10. Still think that's an area they could do in the summer. So maybe one of those two would fit that bill. But drifting it back to this season and Stoke and maybe the upcoming game, Sam, there's 5 games between now and the international break that's on the horizon. There's 3 home games in that: Oxford, Sheffield Wednesday, Stoke, and then the away games of Bristol City and Blackburn. How big, I suppose, is this next block of 5 games before that break? Because, this season, irrespective of your view on whether Norwich will get the top 6 or they won't, or where they'll finish in this league in this season, it feels like if they are going to try and get to the top 6, the next 5 games could probably determine that, because you get to another 5 games down the track and it's 8 games left this season, and they probably would leave themselves with too much work to do.
Yeah, I think it's really important for the short term and for the long term. As you mentioned, they will still be hoping to get to the playoffs, which obviously we can debate the long term merits of. But there's also the long term factor, which I think we've seen play out, to be honest, over the last 3 games, which is that you do need to get results every now and then to keep people on side, because it's not just about the big goal at the end of the season. It's not just about if you actually sat every Norwich fan down and said, okay, being serious, if Norwich get to the playoffs, will they get promoted to the Premier League? If they get promoted to the Premier League, do they have any chance of staying up with this current team? Probably the answer to both of those questions would be no. But when you're paying your hard-earned money, when you're travelling across the country to go and watch your team play, you want to see at least some signs of encouragement, even if they're not on a consistent basis. You just want those moments to be able to cling to, and there haven't really been many of those in the last 3 games. So I think for the morale of the fan base and for the attempts to keep them on side as they complete this long-term rebuild, I think it's big to at least get some results over these next 5 games. If they don't get a win over the course of those, then to be honest, I'll be shocked, but also it'll be pretty disastrous for fan mood. So I think to keep people on side, mainly, it's important, but also we know that, football is mainly a short-term game. And even though, Napa and to an extent Torrop will be looking at the long term, those players in that changing room will be doing absolutely everything they can to get to the playoffs. They'll be, eating, breathing and sleeping the playoffs and thinking about that on a really, on a almost hourly basis about how they can achieve that goal. So I think for them to do that, they do need to get probably 3 or 4 wins at least out of these next 5 games. And although it's disappointing that they haven't been able to get the results against the teams towards the bottom of the league, in a way, if you could choose, you'd pick these upcoming games, because although they are more winnable games than maybe some of the the tough ones a couple of months ago, they're the sort of games that will be tight and will be against their sort of playoff rivals. So if they can get wins in those, then it's almost 6 points per game that they can collect. So I think it is hugely important, and yes, it's now just about whether they can step up to the plate. But you'd say with those injuries now starting to get a little bit better, although obviously I'm sure we'll go down to the press conference tomorrow and Torrop will tell us about 3 more who are out injured. But it does feel like everything still is going in the right direction, and there is an opportunity for them there. Now it's just about them going and taking it.
Yeah, still 4 points off, so an opportunity to try and narrow that gap, I think, over the next 5 games if they're going to do it, particularly given they play the likes of Blackburn, Bristol City, that are kind of in that clutch of teams in and around it. It's intriguing to see how they get on, but maybe, confidence a little bit lower after the 3 recent results against teams that are all kind of in that bottom half mix. So I can understand where some of the frustration is coming from. I think, we've been going for 50 minutes, so it's probably got to the point where I'm going to ask you for a score prediction, Sam. How you see this game unfolding? Stoke, I think, have got a few injury problems coming into this game. I don't know when their press conference is, and they'll probably get a little bit more of an update. But I know the likes of Sam Gallagher's on the way back for them, Pearson as well, who I know a lot of Norwich fans have maybe not got the best memories of from that performance. Was it Bournemouth he was playing for at the time, and he got who did he get sent off? Buendia, I think, off the top of my head.
Yeah, it was. Didn't they won 3-1 at Carrow Road, didn't they?
Yeah, that's right.
It was like after Norwich had been promoted. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think he might be back available. So intriguing to see. Obviously, Gibson, as the Chink for Canary says, I know he's struggling a little bit. I know he hasn't started actually the last game or two. He did in the Cup, and I think he played in a 2-0 defeat of Bristol City for those guys and said he was pretty poor. So whether he'll get the nod to start on Saturday is one to watch. But how do you see the game unfolding, Sam? And give me a score prediction.
It's just so tough because those last 3 games have obviously thrown everything into doubt. It felt before those it was so easy to predict. Norwich wins and everything's going in their favour, and they're going to get to the playoffs. But it does just sow that seed of doubt in your mind a little bit. However, I think just based on logic rather than feelings and not wanting to jinx anything, it feels like it's a game that they should be winning, and with the motivation of a full week to let those 3 disappointing results sort of marinate and to think about those, I think there will be the motivation there. There should be the concentration there, and obviously we'll have to wait and see tomorrow's press conference. But you'd hope that they have at least 1 or 2 of those key midfielders back as well. So I'm feeling confident about Norwich's chances. I don't think it'll be an easy one, so I'll say 2-1. What about you, Adam?
Yeah, Norwich not lost to Stoke in any of the last 8 meetings. So generally being a club they've done pretty well against in recent times. But these stats are always there to be broken, and we always caveat everything with that. I think their lack of firepower is an interesting one. I know they've got Al Hamadi from Ipswich on loan now, who's I think caught the eye a little bit in some early appearances, got a goal in his debut, but not scored since. Obviously lost Tom Cannon, who was kind of their top goal scorer, recalled by Leicester and sent to Sheffield United, as I said, joint lowest scorers in the division with Plymouth. So goals are not something that naturally come to them very easily. So I think with that, it's going to be tight. Defensively, they're pretty decent. So I'm going to let's go 1-0 Norwich, which would be a win. And I think that would just ease a few kind of sort of frustrations that certain individuals and fans are feeling at the moment, which is understandable because, I think the excitement and the sort of feeling that was building after that Watford game and the games that were ahead in the upcoming week, and to not come away with the sort of point tour they would have wanted is understandable. Jonathan with a late comment on YouTube. Clearly we've had some issues with injury and bans. With a fully fit squad, it feels like this is already a top 6 side. Doesn't need a massive overhaul in the summer, just replacements for those who leave. And I think, that's probably right, Sam, isn't it? Because it is kind of a squad that's still building, and they will lose a couple over the summer. But, you add a few more individuals into that mix, and it doesn't feel also bad maybe relative to last summer where, you lost a lot of older players and kind of the squad looked a little bit decimated.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that they'll need to address, and that's the homegrown quota, which obviously has got quite a lot tougher with Grant Hanley and Ashley Barnes both leaving, Angus Gunn likely to leave in the summer as well. So that's probably something they need to address. Also, the age profile, I think, is maybe slightly too young at the moment. Obviously, they'll want players who can still develop, as I spoke about, with that sort of squad building and the fact that you want everyone to be arriving at their peak almost at the same time. But you could sign players who are sort of 23, 24, and by the time, Oscar Schwartau is getting, into his early 20s, Ante Cianats has had a couple of seasons, Mankel Forsen would be 23, 24, and they would still be, 26, 27 and perfectly young enough to compete at championship level. So maybe some of those players in that sort of age bracket, because it feels like right now there's almost young players and there's old players and there's nothing in between. So probably a couple of areas they need to address, but I agree it probably shouldn't be the same sort of rebuild that there was last summer, because we need to see some consistency at some point, and Torrent will want to get a team that's cohesive rather than just completely turning over every summer. So I think that's probably quite an accurate assessment, even though they will have objectives to fulfill going into the summer.
Yeah, see if the squirrel signs for next season as well after his good performance against Hull last Saturday. I think that was probably round us off for this show. Of course, thanks for all your comments, questions, viewing this show this lunchtime. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. We've got lots of good content across our YouTube channel at the moment. I spoke to a Stoke journalist yesterday, so a little bit more of an insight on the Potters and what they might be as a test for Norwich on Saturday on that show. Sam's been down to the Fan Hub a couple of times this week, so you've got an interview with JHT, kind of a little bit more away from the football, a bit more kind of how he's settling into life in Norfolk, sort of maybe some of the learning curves he's had to go on as a coach, certainly coming across to England for the first time. So that's well worth checking out. Anis Ben Slimani as well, a bit more of a chat with him and how he's finding life in Norwich. Obviously, also got Shannon Shaw on there, so a little bit more from the women's team content as well. Plenty of good stuff coming your way as well. Sam will do Tactics Board for tomorrow morning. We'll be down at the press conference as well tomorrow lunchtime, so that'll be available on our YouTube channel. That's about all the stuff that goes on print and digital. You can take out the app subscription, everything across there, the likes of Chris Sutton's column, Ewan's column, etc., etc. Plenty of good stuff to get your teeth into. And of course, we've also got all of our social channels, which I'm sure you're well accustomed to by this point. A 1-1 score prediction there. So yeah, let's see what we get on Saturday. Thanks for joining us this lunchtime. As I say, check out all the rest of our content. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Enjoy your weekend, and hopefully Norwich City can get back to winning ways on Saturday.